Hello everybody, Landa here, and today I will be giving you my review of John Wick Chapter 4. Now, right off the bat, I want to say that this is my favorite movie of the year so far, so I'm a big fan of it, and really I've been a big fan of the John Wick franchise ever since I first saw it. Each movie manages to have both an interesting display of action and martial arts while also even having a coherent story and lore to the world of John Wick. And you get that throughout the movies, and I'd say that there isn't really a bad John Wick movie out there, and this is no exception to that. I love the action that these movies present and just how badass John Wick is as a character. And so I was going into this movie with high expectations, and even those expectations I think were surpassed. So this movie, excellent, and I have a lot to say about it. But first things first, I do want to mention that this is going to be a spoiler review, therefore there will be spoilers. So if you don't want to be spoiled at any point parts of the movie, I'd recommend clicking off this and watching it because it's a great movie. But yeah, so let's get into this. I first want to start off by mentioning the setting. I think the setting is actually a fairly important part of the John Wick franchise. I just love that it manages to have some really interesting settings and set pieces to put these fight scenes and stuff inside of. And this movie nails it with the setting. I'd say, first off, you got like the kind of a unique aspect is that this movie doesn't feature much of New York City, which is a very prominent location in John Wick. All the previous three movies had a lot taking place in New York City, so this movie kind of goes abroad a bit more, and we get to see Osaka, which is just a really great setting for John Wick, especially since John Wick is martial arts inspired. You get a lot of that martial arts inspired fighting going on in Osaka, and just the setting fits. It works really well. Berlin is another one. I wasn't thinking about Berlin being in this going into it, but it was, and I think that managed to have its own cool little spin on things. Again, just going abroad. But of course, I can't talk about the setting and not mention the primary setting of this movie, and that is Paris. Now, Paris is not necessarily a city I would look at and say, oh yeah, that's a John Wick movie setting right there. Because Paris is so romanticized, so to speak, in other forms of media. So having this gritty action movie take place primarily in Paris seemed like a strange decision. However, actually watching it and seeing all that took place there, I think it worked perfectly, and they managed to use the city to their advantage in promoting the epicness of the fight scenes and the story. And I think that they did a good job at the setting overall, just continuing the trend of a great environment to have John Wick in. So as far as the setting goes, I'd say it does a great job in that aspect. Next up, and this is a big one, I want to talk about the characters. Now, of course, I gotta first talk about John Wick himself. I feel like his character almost was not as interesting as it was in the prior John Wick movies. I'd say that wasn't the strong suit of the movie. He had a few lines, but nothing really all that memorable. But I'd say that still, his fighting was phenomenal, and you're rooting for him, at least I was, throughout the whole movie. And I'd say, yeah, he's actually one of the characters I have the least to say about, because I'd say the other characters in this movie do a lot to really make themselves interesting. And even though this is John Wick, we got a whole cast of great characters. One of these being Kane. He's established to be kind of an old friend of John Wick's, but he is hired by the Marquis, which I'll get to in a second. But he's hired to track down and kill John Wick. And what makes him so interesting is that he's blind. But despite that, he can still go toe to toe with John Wick and all these hordes of enemies, all these other assassins. And it's really just a unique fighting style, that we haven't gotten to see in John Wick before. Now, he really reminds me of Daredevil and just kind of how the fighting and action goes on with that series. And so I'd say that right there, Kane was interesting in it of itself. But then they add this extra dynamic where he's motivated by his daughter. He doesn't want his daughter to be harmed, and he'll do anything for her, which means he will go against his old friend John Wick and try to kill him just so he can keep his daughter safe. And I think that is a very believable motivation and makes it so that even though he's going against John Wick in this movie, you don't really hate him or anything. You understand him, but you're still going to cheer against him if you're cheering for John Wick. Another great character in this movie is the character who just went by Nobody. I don't remember if he was actually given an actual name or if that's just what he's referred to as, but he was a great character, and he was really an interesting look at someone who is totally motivated by money, or at least was in the beginning, and throughout the movie, he's kind of just waiting till the bounty on John Wick goes up so he can take him out when it's at its highest. And so it's almost like he's helping John Wick through most of this movie just because he wants to see that money go up and he wants to gain the big prize in the end and doesn't want anyone else keeping him from that. But then throughout the movie, I feel like his character kind of sees what's going on, and at the end, John Wick saves his dog, which causes him to kind of forget the money and help out John Wick, which I think is a really cool little arc in there. And also just the dynamic with the dog and how he's just this like epic assassin character, but still has time to pet his dog and all that. I think it's just funny, and the whole emotional support dog thing, that's funny. A well-written character. And then, of course, there is the big bad, the Marquis, who's kind of the face of the table in this movie. They gave him all their resources, and so he's tasked with hunting down John Wick and killing him. And, as he says himself, the idea of John Wick. And I'd say that he does a good job at being a intimidating and unlikable villain in a good way, if that makes sense. You're going to want to root for this guy. He's a very arrogant character who is so blinded by his angst against John Wick that he even makes moves that don't end up benefiting him and it lead to his demise. But through all this, I think he does a good job at being this face of the table, where I feel like the table was more of an idea, and the Marquis kind of gave the table an actual person to personify it. And I think that the Marquis was a pretty well done villain. Besides those characters I mentioned, there are also plenty of other great side characters besides the ones I just mentioned. Again, the characters are great in this movie. There's so many memorable ones, and I'd say that's actually out of all the good things about this movie, the characters might be the best, and that's saying something, because there's a lot of other great aspects to this movie. Next up is the story, which, kind of piggybacking off of the characters, it's really all about this motivation aspect. Each of the three main assassins in here have their own motivations, and I love how there's a scene in Berlin where the movie points out that all three of the characters have the same end goal. However, they have different ways on getting there and different motivations, which is just a really interesting concept. I feel like that is almost the theme of this movie. Just motivations. What are you fighting for? And specifically with John Wick, he kind of got rid of the idea of taking out the entire table and instead just focused on getting his freedom from the table and reuniting with his wife. And at the end of the movie, he finally dies. And it's not done in a bad way, though. In fact, I think they probably did the best job at killing him off that they could have, because they still make it honorable, you know. He didn't just die, he died getting both his freedom and his friend's freedom. And he also gave a message to the table before he died. And all that wrapped up, and he's buried right next to his wife. It's really heartwarming, and I think that if John Wick had to go, this would be the way to do it. And so I'm glad that they didn't just stick him with a knife and say, oh, he's dead now. You know, they definitely did him justice. But yeah, there isn't really a dull moment in this movie. It travels around the world from each scene, just exciting things, whether it's an action scene or it's just building up the characters, showing the setting, all that. I think it's great. You know, and the whole thing builds up to this big duel in the end, and I just say the way the story is laid out, it's done in a great way. I'd say my major issue with the third one, even though I still love the third movie, is that the middle can get a little sometimes, you know, the whole trudging through the desert part. So this movie doesn't have that, though. I think this movie keeps its pace and keeps going well through from start to finish, and I love that about it. This wouldn't be John Wick if it weren't for the fights. John Wick fight scenes are legendary at this point. The amount of creativity the writers managed to get in here is awesome, along with the martial arts and just the length of them. They go on for a while, and they're all exciting, though. It's not like, oh, it's going on too long. I feel like they do a perfect job at making these long, but also very interesting fights. And the first of these big fights takes place in Osaka, which I alluded to earlier, but I love how this fight scene really utilizes martial arts and martial arts weapons like katanas and such to the full potential. I think that just having it take place in the Osaka Continental was a great idea and really just pumps up the action in this movie and gets you hype. There's so many different aspects going on to this fight where you have John Wick fighting some characters, you've got Kane in there, you've got the manager of the Osaka Continental fighting along with his daughter. All that, it's just awesome, and it really is an amazing adrenaline-filled sequence. Then, towards the middle of the movie, there's a fight scene in Berlin, specifically in a nightclub owned by a man that John Wick has to kill in order to get his family's crest. And this one's neat because it features the three main assassins all fighting hordes of goons, and it's got this crazy intense music blaring throughout the whole thing. But then you have the epic fight in Paris, and this fight did not hold back. This fight has a timed aspect where John Wick needs to be at a certain place at a certain time, and the more he's fighting, the more of that time it's taking up, and that right there adds a whole sense of tension to it. And then you've got the music and the radio woman in the Eiffel Tower kind of giving her little spiel while playing intense songs that just drive up the tension even more. And then you just have how sprawling this fight is. It goes all over Paris. Each location has a new dynamic that just really brings up the fights even more. You've got him fighting in the middle of the streets around the Arc de Triomphe. You've got him walking around a building shooting explosive bullets at people. You've got him trying to race up the stairs while enemies are coming at him one by one. It's epic. It has so many layers, and it goes on for a while. But again, there's so much here that I don't even mind it. It just awesome. A great final action scene for John Wick. And all this leads up to the final duel, which isn't some crazy action-packed intense battle, but what it does have is that tension. The stakes are at their highest during this duel, and this is really the climax of the movie and the entire John Wick series up until this point. It's well done, and a worthy finale to these 4 John Wick movies. Well, here we have my final thoughts, and right off the bat, I'm going to say it. This is my favorite John Wick movie. I think it perfectly encapsulates what John Wick is and what these movies are, and it's the best of the three movies prior. It just excellent, fires on all fronts, and on top of all that, it finishes up John Wick's story in an excellent way, and it managed to be very exciting and entertaining throughout. This movie is amazing, and I wonder if they have any plans on continuing the franchise, whether that be through prequels or spin-offs or whatever. It's going to be interesting to see, but for now, this is a great conclusion, and I fully recommend this movie to anyone who hasn't seen it yet. Well, there you have it. There's my review of John Wick Chapter 4. This is my first official review video on this channel, so let me know what you think about it, if I did a good job. And if you'd like to see more of these videos in the future, I enjoy watching movies, so I'll have plenty of movies that I can potentially review. But for now, I'd just like to thank you all for watching, and until next time, see ya.